Sears Home Services is now including the use of nitrogen in HA refrigeration service procedures. These procedures were previously carried out using either deep vacuum or refrigerant, but with less effective results. This video supports the Tech Tools Bulletin TT46-07, which covers safety and general setup of the nitrogen equipment as it applies to HA refrigeration. The regulator and caddy are available from our National Asset Center, and the nitrogen tank is obtained locally. All safety and procedure steps must be followed. Do not use the equipment if it is not completely safe and fully functional. Do not attempt self-repair of a damaged regulator. All connections must be free from oil and debris before assembly. Do not overpressurize the regulator or the seal system being tested. All connections must be checked for leaks, and of course, personal protection must be utilized at all times. The tank or cylinder is exchanged or refilled with oxygen-free nitrogen, typically at a local HVAC or welding wholesaler. Since these smaller tanks do vary in color, the tank must indicate the contents as nitrogen. The regulator must be rated for nitrogen, of course, and equipped with a tank pressure gauge, a working pressure gauge, pressure adjustment handle or knob, and a 1/4 inch male flare hose connection in order to connect to the manifold gauge set. The regulator must also be equipped with a safety pressure relief valve. The standard manifold gauge set for the type of refrigerant contained in the product is used to apply the nitrogen to the seal system and monitor the system pressure. On 3-port models, the center port must have a shutoff valve or one must be added. The high side and low side hoses must each have a hand valve at the end to be connected to the seal system. The manifold gauge set must not incorporate a sight glass, nor should nitrogen be applied to any type of sight glass. Do not use a process tube adapter on capillary tubing when pressurizing with nitrogen, and do not use a process tube adapter when pressurizing above 170 pounds per square inch. Process tubing adapters may be used on tubing sizes 3/16 to 3/8 inch up to 170 pounds per square inch, and following the tool manufacturer's instructions. Before the tank can be transported in the vehicle, the valve must be completely closed, regulator removed, and firmly strapped to a stationary part of the vehicle using non-elastic strapping. The regulator must also be protected from damage and debris. The tote or caddy provides the proper support when carrying the tank to and from the work area, and can be used to provide the necessary 2-level support of the tank during transport. Additional precautions are necessary due to the extreme pressure within the tank, which is typically above 2000 psi at first use. Always follow the regulator manufacturer's operating instructions. Nitrogen is odorless and can displace oxygen. Therefore, it must only be used in a well-ventilated area, as is required during any seal system repair. Always monitor the work pressure while the tank is open to ensure the system test pressure is not exceeded. Otherwise, metal components may rupture, creating harmful flying shrapnel. Close the nitrogen tank anytime your attention is elsewhere or as soon as the desired system pressure is reached. The system design or test pressure ratings can typically be found listed on the model serial tag. In this example, the high side, when isolated for testing, should not exceed 300 psi, and the low side not to exceed 140 psi. If the complete system is being tested, the pressure should not exceed the lowest rating, which in this case is 140 psi. In the case where the design or test pressure information is not provided, on standard domestic refrigerators and freezers, use 140 psi for the low side and 200 psi for the high. Before using the nitrogen equipment,
all refrigerant must be recovered per EPA and company standards.
place the tank and tote close to the work but out of the way to prevent falling over. Point the tank port away from personnel and crack the valve open briefly to clear the connection. Back out the regulator adjustment all the way. Attach the clean regulator to the tank and tighten. Do not use grip-type pliers. All connections must be free of oil and debris. The equipment must be visually examined before applying nitrogen pressure or connecting to a seal system. Make sure the hoses are not cracked and seals and gauges are in good shape. Then perform a leak test on the equipment. Open all manifold and hose valves to bleed off any remaining pressure from the manifold gauge set. Connect the high side hose with hand valve to one of 3 storage posts on the back side of the manifold. Do the same with the low side hose with hand valve. Connect the center port hose to the nitrogen regulator outlet or the delivery port on the regulator. Turn the regulator adjustment counterclockwise until no resistance is felt to make sure it is off. With all manifold and hose valves in the open position, slowly crack open the nitrogen tank valve only partially. The regulator tank pressure gauge will measure the tank pressure, and the other gauge on the regulator is the working pressure, which should still be reading 0 psi at this point. Both gauges on the manifold should also be at 0. Slowly rotate the regulator screw clockwise to the pressure corresponding to the manifold gauge set low side gauge pressure before reaching the retard pressure range. Typically, this is 120 psi on R134A manifold gauge sets. Listen for leakage and back off the regulator if any is heard. Notice the regulator working pressure gauge increases as well as the high and low side manifold gauges. Stop at 120 psi for this manifold gauge. Do not use the equipment until any and all leaks are repaired. Close the nitrogen tank and notate exact pressures on both the manifold gauges, high side and low side, and the regulator working pressure gauge. All 3 should compare closely to each other. Close the center port valve and compare the low side gauge pressure again in 10 minutes. If pressure is lower by any amount, locate a leak using an approved leak detection solution. Repair any and all leaks in the equipment and retest before using the equipment to determine if a leak exists on any seal systems. Most regulators are non-relieving, so if the pressure is ever adjusted too high, close the center port valve, rotate the regulator adjustment counterclockwise, relieve some pressure from the system, reopen the center port valve, and then readjust the regulator. When finished, close the manifold center port valve and cylinder valve completely. Turn the regulator adjustment counterclockwise until no resistance is felt, in other words, turned off. Carefully and slowly loosen the regulator outlet hose connection to relieve pressure until the working pressure gauge reads 0 psi. Place the center hose into a shop towel and slowly open the center port valve until the manifold gauge reads 0 psi. Rotate the regulator adjustment clockwise until the tank pressure gauge reads 0 psi. Rotate counterclockwise fully to relieve all tension on the diaphragm and to set up for next use. Remove the regulator and seal and protect the ports from contamination in preparation for storage. At some point before using nitrogen, communicate with the member so any misconception is avoided about vapors being released within the home and into the atmosphere. Mrs. Jones, after recovering refrigerant from the system, you may hear me using a small amount of dry nitrogen during the routine service procedure on your refrigerator. It is harmless to the environment and people, as nitrogen is already about 80% of the air around us. Do you have any questions before I continue? All equipment must be secure before applying pressure. The nitrogen tank must always be closed anytime your attention is not on the working pressure. This is critical in order to maintain a safe pressure limit on the equipment and product being serviced. This has been the safety and general setup for nitrogen use in home appliance refrigeration. The next service steps will vary depending on the specific task to perform. For the details on using nitrogen for full system leak detection, isolating for a leak, or clearing a restriction, refer to the Seal System Bulletins SS46-11, SS46-12, and SS46-13.